resistance in the system.
Yeah.
All right, you good to go?
Yes.
I can always cut these first couple of minutes out.
Yeah, you can.
And I will.
That was my tech support, Dennis Chapin.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you.
I wouldn't have been able to do it without him.
So here we are, finally. Let's
Finally.
get rolling on this. All these people are waiting for us to get our acts together, and we did. Anyway, Sesh, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
This is a very special episode, in my opinion, because of what we're going to talk about, what you're going to share with us.
Yeah.
And why don't we just jump right in?
Okay. Well, in last year's roundtable podcast featuring Dr. Joseph Farrell, I was asked a question at one point by Dr. Bruce McDonald. I don't know if you remember that, Walter. He wanted to know who I was and why did I exist? Just who was this Sesh Heri? So in particular, he wanted to know how I had made contact with a mysterious individual who in 1992 predicted that the Mandela effect would emerge in the early 21st century. And I answered Dr. McDonald by directing him to my book, The Handprint of Atlas, which contains some autobiographical information. So today I'm going to try to begin to answer some of Dr. McDonald's questions more fully. The answer is long and complicated, but essentially it's grounded in my belief that I am a descendant of two ancient esoteric bloodlines. That is, both my paternal and maternal lines evince some unusual paranormal characteristics. Now, when Walter and I first became acquainted some 20 years ago, we soon discovered that we shared a synchronicity regarding our heritages. One can note the manifestation of this synchronicity today in the stories I'll be revealing about my family history. If you read Walter's book, Shimmering Light, you'll notice the similarities between Walter's father and uncle and my father and uncle. Have you had any thoughts along those lines, Walter, to say? I've lost your voice. I can't hear you, Walter. Can you hear me? There.
Sorry, it was very weird when we did share these details. But no, you go ahead. Keep going.
Okay, so I'd like to start by going back 100 years. Yeah, 100 years. Because that's how long I have evidence that my extended family has had direct contact with non-humans, what are usually referred to as ETs, extraterrestrials, or aliens. I don't like those designations because these terms are freighted with a host of assumptions that may not be true or accurate. Non-human is a neutral term, and it's a good place to start and maybe to finish as well. This first event occurred in late 1924 or maybe early 1925. I didn't know about this incident until I was in my mid-30s. My mother brought it up one day in the course of reminiscing about her childhood. In those days, in the 1920s, my mother and her family lived on the outskirts of Phoenix City, Alabama, in a farmhouse that had just been built by my grandfather. My grandparents slept in the front room, and their children, my mother and her two brothers, slept in another nearby room. The kids slept in a big four-poster bed with a very tall headboard that extended perhaps as much as 6 or 7 feet from the floor. This night, my grandmother was awakened by screams and cries coming from the children's room. She rushed in there and flipped on the light. all three children were out of their bed and perched upon the upper ledge of the headboard, their feet dangling down. This included my mother, who was only about a year and a third old, practically an infant. She sat beside her two older brothers, who were 5.5 and 4 years old, respectively. All of them were shouting and crying hysterically and incoherently. My grandmother got all her kids down from the headboard and back into bed, telling them to settle down. They just had a bad dream. All three of them? One had upset the others, was my grandmother's reasoning. Only one problem with that. How in hell did all three kids end up on that headboard? How did they all get up there? It must have been that the 5-year-old climbed up first somehow, and then the 4-year-old followed him, and somehow the two of them were able to drag the baby, my mother, up onto the headboard too, somehow, without the infant tipping off from her precarious perch. That was the, quote, explanation, unquote, of the event, the debunking in which my grandmother indulged. It was a nightmare, a scramble and a tussle to the headboard, go back to sleep, end of the matter. But the matter wouldn't end because the two boys, my two uncles, wouldn't stop talking about what had happened. My mother, hardly being able to talk, said nothing, and later she remembered nothing of the event except for what she heard from her two brothers and my grandmother. Well, what did these people, these witnesses to this event, say? My two uncles recounted an event that involved a, quote, little man, unquote. They said they woke up suddenly to see a little man peering in through the window at them at their right. This little man then entered their bedroom by passing magically through the solid closed glass pane. This little man approached the bed and sat down on it, directly facing my uncle, who was 5. My 4-year-old uncle also had an up-close view of the little man, who the two boys largely could only see as a silhouette against the dim glow of the window behind him. The little man began to speak to my uncle in a foreign language, which the 4-year-old boy could not understand. The 5-year-old, however, could not only somehow understand this language, but found that he could speak it himself. A conversation back and forth between the little man and my uncle ensued. What did they say? Many decades later, when I interviewed my uncle about this matter, I asked him this very question. What was said in that conversation? He glanced about the room warily and then replied, a lot was said. My uncle's wife came into the room and my uncle refused to discuss the matter any further. I also later interviewed my other uncle about the incident of the little man. He told the same thing that his brother did, but he added, after the little man left the room, all three of us suddenly found ourselves sitting on top of the high headboard. Neither boy had any memory of how they got up onto that headboard, but both of them speculated that they must have climbed up there. And my uncle said, we must have pulled her up there. That was just his speculation. He, in fact, had no memory of pulling his sister up on that ledge. That story of the little man was carried down through the decades in our family anecdotes until I finally heard it in about the year of 1990. In my opinion, the little man incident was not a dream. Both of my uncles remembered the experience with all of its bizarre details. And both of the brothers and my mother would experience subsequent life events consistent with the explanation that the little man incident of the mid-20s was an abduction of my two uncles and my mother by non-humans, the events of which were almost entirely blocked hypnotically from their conscious recall. Walter, do you have any comments to bring to the table at this point? Are you there? Very well. Walter?
Yeah, keep on going. I'm listening.
Okay. Well, I'm just cutting off for a second. Do you want to say anything so far?
No, that's what I'm saying. This is
Okay.
let them just immerse them into this, and then we'll
okay.
We'll,
So now let's fast forward a handful of years. My uncle, who was about 4 in 1924, is now about 9 or 10 years old. Suddenly, he starts having spontaneous nosebleeds. Various, quote, explanations, unquote, and causes are put forth by my grandmother and others. The nosebleeds and the folk remedies continue until my uncle is taken to the doctor. The doctor uses an electrified probe to cauterize the insides of my uncle's nasal passages and sinuses. This stops the nosebleeds. Of course, we know now that children who have been abducted by non-humans sometimes experience profuse nosebleeds from having the far reaches of their nasal passages pierced by a metal probe or instrument. What's the purpose of this? We might begin to get an idea of what's going on when we consider what happened to me decades later, as we will do in future podcasts. While all of this was going on in the 1920s, my father was having his own set of experiences. When I was very small, my dad would reminisce about his boyhood when he would explore the woods at night. There was a phenomenon that he and his friends would sometimes experience that they called jack-o'-lanterns or foxfire. These would be glowing objects that would rise up out of the woods and hover overhead. My dad also talked about boogers. Yes, boogers. This was the term used in Alabama for Bigfoot. They knew a booger was out and about because of its terrible stench. Also, the things would yell out an unearthly cry that sounded like a very large, powerful woman's voice, high-pitched, but very strong. It was a sound sometimes mistaken for a wildcat. I know that sound, for I used to hear it at night as a boy, sleeping in my grandparents' farmhouse. The boogers would wander through the nearby woods that ran along Holland Creek. When my father and his brother were about 10 or 11 years old, they witnessed an actual shape-shifting incident, some kind of lycanthropy, which is usually associated with black magic, as with werewolves. This happened in southern Alabama, about 1929. My dad and his brother were with a number of other boys their own age, standing around and sitting upon a rail fence at the edge of a field growing sugarcane. In front of them lay a dirt road, and on the other side of the road lay a field with a stand of corn ripe for harvesting. That tells you the time of year, probably late August 1929. The boys were all shooting the breeze and eating sugar cane. And one of them says, "Hey, looky yonder, in the distance, coming up that dirt road." They spied an old woman in an old-fashioned dress, her skirt coming all the way down to her shoes. She was holding the hand of a little girl about 5 years of age, The little girl walked beside her. As the two of them approached, the boy saw that the old woman was wearing a bonnet with its brim shading her face from the sun. The boys began muttering among themselves, trying to figure out who these two people were. One of them said, "Well, I think that's old Lizzie Gilly. Maybe the child's her granddaughter." Everyone at first acceded to this interpretation until another boy said, "No, can't be Lizzie Gilly. Didn't she die a few months ago?" The boys fell silent. Now they recalled Lizzie Gilly was dead, been dead a while. The two strangers drew closer yet. Now they could see the old woman's face a bit clearer. It sure looked like Lizzie Gilly. Then all the boys froze in fear. They could clearly see the old woman's face start to distort in an ungodly manner. The nose of the old woman grew outward until it became a snout. The change continued until the old woman's visage took on the form of a dog or a wolf. "It's a dog face," somebody whispered. Strange figures now moved toward the cornfield and entered it, disappearing from sight and into the thick rows of corn stalks. Suddenly, the boys darted across the dirt road and plunged into the corn, following the track of the mysterious pair. As soon as they were well into the corn, they all heard a rumble, and suddenly a team of horses crashed right through where the woman and child should have been. A man appeared seated on a wagon driving that team of horses. The boys cried out to him, "The old lady! The old lady! Did you see the old lady?" "I ain't seen nothing," the man declared. The old woman and child were gone and never seen again. Stranger things have happened. But I suppose this was strange enough, especially if this event is placed in context with all the other things my father and mother experienced before I was ever born. My father and mother grew up. My father joined the Civilian Conservation Corps when he was 17 and went to work in Tennessee. And then after his time was up there, he joined the U.S. Army. He was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia. He did that for basic training. It was during this time that he met my mother, who was working in a food processing plant in Columbus, Georgia. Tom's Peanuts. Tom's was a kind of Willy Wonka type of candy factory. My father served in World War II. He was sent to Iceland, then to England, and then he entered frontline fighting in France and Germany. At an early age, I learned the history of World War II from my father, who had lived it and helped make it happen. He fought in the fiercest battles, including the Battle of the Bulge under General George Patton. My father would tell everything about his many battles and the many times that he was nearly killed. He left no detail out, no matter how gory. Many a time we'd be having dinner and my dad would be talking about finding the bodies of dead German soldiers all rotted up and bloated, just as I was about to put a spoon of food in my mouth. Don't get me wrong, I was fascinated with these stories, and I got used to the gory parts. My dad swimming down a creek while his buddies next to him were getting shot to ribbons, the water dyeing red with their blood. I say all this to you so that you'll understand this next part. Every once in a while, in the midst of his war stories, my dad would say, "But there are things I can't talk about. I was ordered not to ever talk." He would always say this in an entirely different tone of voice, like a robot. Things he couldn't talk about, but he had told every rotten, bloody detail. I now strongly suspect that my dad had been hypnotized to forget certain things. And in the late 1950s, he was still under sway of this mind control program. After saying this about his oath not to talk about certain things, he would always add, I was supposed to get a medal. I earned a medal, but they never gave it to me. He always said this with some regret and bitterness. Decades later, when my mother died, my brothers and I went to the Veterans Administration to get a companionate headstone for both my father and mother's graves. My dad had already died in 1975. When the headstone we ordered came back, the long ago words of my father returned to me. I was supposed to get a medal. And there was the medal. On the bottom of my father's marble plaque were the words, Bronze Star recipient. And below the words, an actual bronze star inlaid in the marble. What secret mission had my father successfully carried out that earned him a bronze star? We'll never know for certain. For my brother, Tom, tried for years to access my father's military records. Tom was an expert genealogist, and he knew how to get military records. He got our great-great-grandfather's Civil War record, but he couldn't get my dad's World War II Army record. My uncle's military service was also clouded in mystery. This was my mother's brother, the uncle who had witnessed the little man at the age of 4 and who had those nosebleeds at the age of 10. By the way, this same uncle had the power of second sight, just as my oldest brother and I have. And then also, this uncle, much later in his life, became enmeshed in a major UFO incident. My uncle joined the U.S. Army at the outset of World War II. He had already graduated from high school. He was essentially sent to England and rose to the rank of sergeant. As my uncle glowingly reminisced about his time in the Army, it was clear to all of us in our extended family that his time in England in World War II was the best time of his life. My uncle was on some kind of grand adventure, but the actual sum and substance of this adventure he never would say, except for a few tantalizing details. For example, there was the time toward the end of the war when my uncle was stationed in Italy and was permitted to tour the ruins of Pompeii. He described this fascinating experience to me in detail, and I'm sure that this experience led him to becoming, in his later years, an amateur archaeologist. He worked with university professors on an archaeological site of an Indian village that he had discovered on his Alabama farm. Although my uncle never said so, I suspect that he was involved with the massive troop movement from northern Italy into southern France, the Languedoc, at the end of the war. If any of you have seen the movie or read the book, Monuments Men, you'll understand what my uncle and father were probably involved with toward the end of World War II. I have a rare photo taken in May of 1945 in Austria. It's a picture of my father's unit. With the unit, there is a man that stands as a mysterious anachronism. He is dressed in a military uniform, wears aviator sunglasses, and a pillbox type of hat that I associate with the nation of Morocco. The man is also African in his race. He's a black man. Yet anachronistically, he appears to be either the commanding officer of this unit or an important advisor. I suspect that he is an esoteric advisor, a magician, assigned to help retrieve certain artifacts from the Germans. I know for a fact that my uncle, my mother's brother, was involved in activities that he could not have been doing if he had only possessed the rank of sergeant. I suspect that secretly my uncle was some kind of officer. He worked with colonels and generals. He accompanied these high-ranking officers during one event that was of particular note. This was my uncle's private audience with the Pope. Yes, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in Vatican City. Before going to see the Pope, my uncle told a buddy of his who happened to be a practicing Catholic about what he was going to do. His friend just couldn't believe it. He said, "If you're going to see the Pope, would you take this cross with you and ask him to bless it?" My uncle said that he would do that. So my uncle took the cross and went with a small group of officers from the U.S. Army, colonels and generals. When my uncle came back from the audience and gave his friend the cross, his friend just couldn't believe that my uncle had been in the presence of the Pope. His friend wanted to hear all the details. So my uncle described all the details of the meeting, the room, how everyone was standing, how the Vatican guard came into the room carrying the Pope upon a bier with the Pope seated upon a throne. He told what the Pope was wearing and what the Pope had said to him and how he had blessed the cross. Then my uncle's friend said, "I believe you. You really did see the Pope." What was this private audience all about? I believe it was a ceremonial thank you from the Holy See to the U.S. government for the return of all the priceless artifacts and artwork rescued from the Nazis. This was the conclusion of the Monuments Men project, and my uncle had been a part of it. Why? For the same reason I believe that my father was also part of it. They, my father and his future brother-in-law, my uncle, were descendants of esoteric bloodlines that made them an asset to a secret project that was itself magical. Do you have any comments there, Walter? Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I've been listening.
Any comments yet?
I'm familiar with the story, so I'm just listening and letting the audience kind of soak it in.
I'm hoping they can absorb some of this that I'm reading off here. Okay, so I'll continue. Now, I'd like to move decades ahead to when my mother was in her last year of life. This was 2009. She was suffering from a number of ailments. The most significant was dementia, caused in part by small strokes, but probably also by Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. She was living in a nursing home, and I'd go over every day to check on her. The nursing staff began asking me, "Why does your mother always call out for missing babies?" She'll say, the babies. Where are they? What happened to them?" She'll get frantic. I knew what they were talking about. Before my mother went into the home, she would sometimes call out for the babies. I told the staff that I thought she was remembering the time when she worked in a daycare center and took care of small children and babies. I asked them, "Isn't it somewhat common for elderly patients with dementia to call out for babies?" "No," they said. "We never had a resident who called out for babies." They thought my mother's case was unusual. A little later, I was talking on the phone with my mother's youngest brother. I told him what the nurses had been saying about the babies. He said, "I think I know what that's all about. She's thinking about all those miscarriages she had." Miscarriages? I never, up to that point, knew that my mother had any miscarriages. I told my uncle that. He said, "The reason I suspect the miscarriages is that I overheard Mama and your mother talking about them one time when they thought they were all alone in the house. I was about 12 years old." That would make this about 1950. "Your mother said that she had 2 or maybe 3 miscarriages." I later found out that no one but my uncle knew about my mother's miscarriages. Why had she kept them secret? She told me all kinds of things. For example, she told me that after I was born, her doctor sterilized her so that she could not have any more children. The doctor informed my mother that if she attempted to have any more children, it would kill her. Her reproductive organs were so worn out. This is understandable if she had already had 3 miscarriages and 3 full-term deliveries. But subsequent events would cast even more light upon my mother's reproductive health. Nearly 2 years after I was born, in 1957, my mother had to be operated on for a tumor on her ovaries. The tumor turned out to be benign, but once again, the doctors told her that her ovaries were ravaged. Where has a condition like this been noted before? Try the work of Bud Hopkins, who investigated the case of one Kathy Davis, a pseudonym, who had her eggs removed on several occasions by non-humans. Kathy was required to nurse the hybrid babies created from her eggs and would always cry when her babies were taken away from her. The missing babies. The missing babies. Did something similar happen to my mother in the 1946 to 1950 time period? Our extended family thought that my parents would never have any children. The doctors told them that their blood types were incompatible. The doctors informed my parents that if my mother did conceive a child, it would be extremely deformed. Then suddenly and improbably, in 1952, my oldest brother was born. Then in 1953, my middle brother was born. Then in 1955, I was born. My parents' relationship and marriage can be found as a metaphor in the novel Majestic by Whitley Strieber. In the late 1980s, when Whitley Strieber first came upon the public scene as an abductee in his book Communion, I was highly skeptical of his claims. Had he really been abducted, or had he only jumped on the abductee bandwagon for ulterior purposes? Bit by bit, I came to the conclusion that he at least had somehow gained access to real information about the abduction phenomenon, information that had not been widely publicized at that time. Today, I'd say I'm convinced that he really was abducted, both as a child and as an adult. This, however, does not preclude the possibility that he is driven by some kind of hidden agenda. In particular, I completely disagree with Strieber's interpretation of the non-humans as misunderstood angels on some kind of cosmic mission of mercy to mankind. I think it is exactly the opposite case. Majestic is not science fiction. nor is it a fantasy horror novel. It is, in fact, a work of fantastic realism. It is a fictionalized version of the 1947 Roswell incident. In my opinion, there is both a great deal of valid information in this novel, along with some disinformation. Here I will focus on a subplot in the novel between two fictional characters, Jim Collins and Kathy O'Malley. Jim Collins is abducted by non-humans around the same time that the Roswell incident occurs. He is stationed at Fort Bliss in West Texas when he's abducted. He has already been abducted as a child, and during the Fort Bliss abduction, he's completely under the non-human's hypnotic control. Collins is given the post-hypnotic command to marry Kathy O'Malley, which very shortly he does. Kathy is also under the non-human's hypnotic control. A non-human tells Collins, quote, "You will be married soon, Jimmy. The union will be with your childhood mate, Kathy. Together you will conceive 5 new ones. The last 2 of them will be for you. The first 3 for me," unquote. All of this comes to pass in the story. The characters of Jim Collins and Kathy O'Malley seem to represent for Strieber a kind of category of abductees. These are couples who are subliminally manipulated through hypnosis to conceive children together. Some of the children are destined for genetic manipulation in order to create hybrid non-humans. Their half-siblings are destined for life on Earth as human beings. Could this fate have been mine? Could it be that my whole extended family have been enmeshed in a program of genetic engineering that is a part of the larger plan for the human race as framed by non-humans? In future podcasts, I'll continue to explore these questions as I divulge my own personal experiences with non-humans, synchronicity, space-time distortions, teleportations, parallel universes, and time travel. All right, Walter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, that's thank you for that. Really, folks, is an introduction into the narrative that Sesh is going to be continuing to share here. And what I see in this, as you know, I lean more towards the ultra-terrestrial than the extraterrestrial element.
Yes, I know.
And I think both are actually involved here in the big picture.
Well, I'd like to say this. My view on it is I like the term that these non-humans are non-local.
Right.
Joseph Farrell, he pretty much introduced in alternative research the concept of non-locality, or at least he certainly emphasizes it in his writings,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you have a non-local technology, it turns the beings who are using it into non-local beings.
Yeah.
There's the rumor Werner von Braun claimed that, and this was in regard to Roswell, that these beings were time travelers. They might be us from the future, for example. There's a lot of different kinds of speculations you can apply to this. They could be time travelers. They could be from a parallel universe. We don't know where they're from. I've heard all kinds of UFO researchers claiming that this or that proves they're from here or there. A lot of people like to talk about Zeta Reticuli simply because Betty Hill saw a star map that somebody said that looks like Zeta Reticuli, in the most general way, completely invalid.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's been good research and investigation into that story. Betty embellished a lot and added just enough to it that wasn't in the original experience.
yes,
I think the
I
better
agree with
source in that case is Barney. I think Barney's testimony, Barney's the hypnotherapeutic analysis. I think that's more. I want to say raw data. It's more authentic, but Betty became real popular in the New Age. Everything's ET. They're the peace-loving Space Brothers crowd,
Yes.
and she's an icon of that. And the people that still cling to that, revere her. I am open to, as you mentioned my book Shimmering Light. I explore a couple of possibilities. And as everybody here at the channel knows, and there's still the issue of the footprint of the mysterious Tuatha Danann in our world.
Oh, certainly.
When I've done nearly 20 nonfiction books of different topics, what going into it, I thought I was writing on different topics, and I find, some presence to some degree of the Tuatha Danann in the research for each of them, whether it's Juan Cabrillo and Ambrose Bierce, or whether it's occult murder in San Bernardino in 1915, or breakaway societies, or esoteric Disneyland. There they are. And, they are certainly of non-local origin. And, if you look at the lore, they shared this planet with us while remaining not obvious. And so it could be, I agree with you that there has been some genetic engineering, to a fantastic degree, or at least with a fantastic objective. And yeah, I do think that there are people among us, people in our world, who are monitored because of this very unique and extraordinary DNA. If there was truly a civilization on Mars that was decimated because of a war and there were any survivors, we have to assume that coming here would be one of their objectives, to just get here, to be safe and survive. And if that was a human civilization, which I think it was, they mixed, they over time mixed with us. And there's, I think, a huge majority of people on Earth who have, say, a bit of the DNA of people from Mars. And I would say everybody on this planet, unless they've been living completely secluded, everybody probably has some type of extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, or non-local DNA in them. And I think that powers that be, whatever concerns they have about that or interest they have in that, are watching that. I think the Human Genome Project probably had something like that in mind.
Well, you've said a lot there, Walter. And, the Human Genome Project is something I'm very interested in. And I have a lot of this in a book I've written. The book I'm talking about. Eventually, we'll be getting it out in the next year or two, I think. But there's a lot to the Human Genome Project that doesn't meet the eye. And, in my opinion, modern science, it has two faces. It has the public face and it has the occult face. And they're really doing magic all the time.
Yeah.
The official line is materialism, but the guys at the top, they're doing magic.
Yeah.
Also, the history of our solar system is unknown to us. We just got a little speck of understanding that something went on before we came along. In the last few thousand years, there were all kinds of civilizations in this solar system, and certainly Mars is the number one candidate for an advanced civilization at some point in time. And I think it's a very strong argument that we humans are connected to that. It was a human society on Mars. But I do think there's something to what Zecharia Sitchin writes about with the Sumerian and Babylonian text. There's been genetic tweaking all along. And we're a particular type of human that is very recent on the scene.
Right.
And there's a hidden agenda to why we exist. And I touch upon it a little bit in the Handprint of Atlas, but this next book gets into it even more.
Yeah.
But everything about our civilization, it has an imprint of non-humanity in it. We have a civilization that was actually created for us. We're not aware of that. So our lives today are not what we think they are. And this is what I'm getting to about here with what I just read, that just in my own personal life, until I was about 30, I didn't have a clue about anything. And then I started remembering things. And a lot of this has to do with my abductions when I was young. But I started looking into a lot of things. And I came to the conclusion that everything's out there hidden in plain sight. If we'll just wake up a little bit and we can begin to see some of these things that's going on.
We mentioned earlier about the weird connection that we have. Let's jump over to that, because I know people find that interesting. Sesh and I met in 2004 when he submitted his novel Wonder of the Worlds, which you can get in hardcover at walterbosley.com/shop, and it really is a must read. But you had submitted that, and we got to talking. I'll tell you exactly how we got to talking. The TV was on, and what was playing was the Hank Williams story, I believe, starring Cliff Robertson.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, the Hank Williams story is on, and I mentioned, my Uncle Emmett was like one of Hank Williams' best friends there in Montgomery, Alabama. I grew up hearing about this.
Yeah.
And Sesh happened to mention, well, my family's from Alabama too. And one thing led to another, and here's what we found out. You guys have heard me talk about my mentor for a long time. You've heard me talk about the house that he lived in, the one that had belonged to my aunt's family, his wife's family, and had been built in, it was antebellum, pre-Civil War. And he had refurbished it to the period of 1854. The furnishings, everything. And you guys have heard me talk about it being haunted and my having my ghost experience there and on and so forth. Well, I was telling Sesh about this, and I mentioned that the house had actually been moved from its original position and location, and it was on a very aptly named Shadow Lane Drive for an antebellum haunted mansion 4-story kind of place. And when I told him it had been moved, and he said, what town was that again? And I gave him the town, just a little town outside of Montgomery, Alabama. And I could hear his jaw drop, and he proceeded to tell me, well, what did you tell me, Sesh? You tell them what you told me.
So I don't know if you want to mention the name of the town, but
I don't think it's a problem. It's Prattville, Alabama.
Prattville, Alabama.
Yeah.
The moment Walter said Prattville, I nearly fell out because I knew exactly what house he was talking about. And this house, it's called the Golson House.
Yep.
It was owned originally by a man named Golson, and this was in the Civil War era, antebellum and all that. Well, that house where it originally stood was right next door to my great grandfather's house. And also my grandfather lived there for a time in his youth. So I knew all about that house as well as my own, my grandfather's house.
What are the odds, And
they were right together there. And there's a whole thing about the Golson house. It was haunted before they moved it, by the way. Did you know
sure.
that?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because the ghosts that are there predate the move.
Yeah, it's Civil War ghosts that are in there. And they used to meet there during the Civil War. Soldiers would meet there. It was actually a command center at that time. And my people, they didn't live there during the Civil War. They actually lived up in Wisconsin, but they came down in the late 1880s. And the Golson house was still there. So they knew all about the Golson house. And I believe...
Sesh, let me interrupt you. Folks, if you want to look at this house as we're talking about it, Google it. It is a state historical monument. It has been now for a couple decades. It is called the Pope, Pope, like the guy who runs the big church, Pope Golson, Golsen or On. But look up the Pope Golson house it's an ON, I think, in Prattville, Alabama, and you can look at the house. This is the house that I spent many a night in over the several years and had my ghost experience. And this is the house that Sesh is talking about, that his ancestors had a link to.
Yeah, they lived right next door to them, and they knew that family. Unfortunately, my brother Tom's passed away, but he knew all about the Golson house. Everything I know about it, I got from him. And he had been in the Golson house. It's a museum now, right, Walter?
It's a historical site.
It's a historical.
And last I know about it, I'm not aware that it's set up as a museum yet, but I'm guessing, did your brother go to it, visit it before the move or after the move?
Well, unfortunately, I wish I could answer that, but I'm under the impression he visited it after the move.
Okay.
It was in recent times. It was, the 1990s, early 1990s. When did your uncle own it?
It was my Aunt Betty. It was in her family, but she and him, he owned it from I want to say the early mid 80s up until about early 2000s. So if he visited, it would have been the years that I was coming and going. I was coming and going there between December of 1986 until the summer of 1999 when I passed through, when I got out of the Air Force.
So had it already been moved at that point?
Oh, yeah.
You know what year they moved it?
Well, I'm going to say prior to around 1980.
Yeah. I don't know exactly when my brother discovered this, but it would have to be after 1980. In fact, that was, I think, the first time my brother went back to Prattville and actually visited the old farm. See, my great-grandfather, he had a 500-acre farm there, and I think Golson's was 500 acres, so that'd be about 1,000 acres there side by side.
Yeah, and the house, I got to tell you, the house at the very top above the attic has the observation deck, and folks, that observation deck was used for what you imagine it was used for, and that's because it was a plantation, and they could sit up there and watch the fields and see the progress.
But they also could watch Union soldiers coming up
the road. That too. But at one time, the house was owned or occupied by a man who was either a merchant skipper, or perhaps he was a naval officer, because his ghost shows up in the house I want to say to this day, I don't know what kind of paranormal activity is going on there now, but during the years I was going to the house, I talked with more than one witness of who they called the sea captain.
Yeah,
and,
I kind of remember the captain, the talk about the captain and for my brother. And
I never had him manifest. They always put me in the room that had been his room or the one that he manifests in the most. And I never had any visual manifestations. The manifestation I experienced was I heard it. I heard the woman crying down in what was my uncle's library office, his study, what used to be the nursery back in that time, the mid 19th century. And I heard her, and people have heard me tell it as clearly as you're hearing my voice and I'm hearing Sesh's. I'm hearing this woman cry, and the only other people in the house were three others. They were upstairs, and I could see, I saw them and verified that it wasn't them, and it was pretty wild.
I've never, to my best recollection, ever seen a ghost, but my oldest brother seemed to be sensitive to that. He actually saw our grandmother after she died. That's kind of a bit of a story I won't get into, but he saw that. And he and I were in Vicksburg, Mississippi, some many years ago, back in the 1980s, and in the Memorial Park, and he said that he saw a ghost there and heard it moving through the bushes, and he was quite serious about it. I think he probably did. He had certain sensitivities like that.
There were interesting. My uncle one time, and then I want to after I tell you this a little bit, I want to get into the synchronicities between us on that. But my uncle had told me, this was when I was an agent. Okay, so I'm always armed. All right, I'm a federal agent. I'm always armed. I traveled with it, And I was down from Ohio because this is when I was running the ops branch at Wright Pat. I'm down there visiting, and he told me, he said, there's certain individuals that come here occasionally that have to do business with me. That's how he put it. Now, remember, this uncle, in case you guys don't know, my mentor, he retired with 44 years in the intelligence community of the United States. Okay, so deep stuff. I have reason to believe he was one of the Collins elite, so-called. That's another whole discussion we'll have sometime. But he told me about these people, these men, who, if I ever, he goes, you ever hear a commotion outside, you look out the window and you see me talking with these men. And he described them, and the way he described them, it was like they were very wealthy gypsies, is the best way to put it. And he told me, stay in the house. Under no circumstances was I to go outside when he's meeting with them, even if I saw them harm him. He said, by the time you could get to me, I'd be dead anyway. So, don't come running out. And, he's telling me this. I'm like, I have a gun. I see someone attacking my uncle, what's the thing to do? But he instructed me, ordered me, do not go outside that house. Now, he had people, when he was still active before he retired, he had a couple of guys that were assigned to watch him. And one of the first times I went to visit, I was there. I got there too earlier than I said I was going to arrive. And there was a new guy. And he's telling me, he said, you go walking up to the door, and what you don't know is the red bead from the infrared laser sight was on the back of your head. And the guy contacted his TL and said, unknown, unsubbed, standing at the door, male, Caucasian, 6'1", whatever. Yeah, at that time I was 219, lean for me, fighting pounds.
Yeah.
And so the other guy said, no. He goes, that's his nephew. He's a good guy. And my uncle's telling me this. I'm like, oh, for crying out loud. So I understood, one of the reasons why he said, don't go running out there, because something happens to him, there's going to be bullets flying. everywhere. And so, I did as I was told with him. He was someone I answered to and reported to. Anyway, here's what's interesting, folks, the connection here. We're talking about my father, who was in the military, who worked on some secret weird thing. Sesh's father was in the military, worked on a secret weird thing. We're also talking about our uncles that we were close to, and each of these uncles were like a mother's brother. My mom's brother was my mentor. Sesh's mom's brother was this uncle about which he speaks, and the connecting thing there, the crystallization point, is the Pope Golson house. And when you think about the Pope Golson house and the stories of the ghosts, and we're talking about time and interdimension, it blew our minds back in 2004, but we had not been yet on this roller coaster journey of synchronicity and karmic frequency that we were to share and each experience over the next several years. So looking back on it, it should not have surprised us at all that he found me to publish his book.
Yes. We both learned a tremendous amount in the last 20 years, but we also knew quite a bit already at that time, enough to understand what we had to some extent.
That there was something indeed extraordinary going on.
It was something real, and to take it seriously. I use this term memory theater a bit. This is an example of what I mean by a memory theater, this juxtaposition of these two houses and how they encapsulate these lineages of you and me, in our relatives. It's almost like a hieroglyph, but it's a living hieroglyph. It's full of information, and we can begin to decode it a bit, but definitely it's topological, because we both have an uncle who is our mother's brother, and then we have our father, and somehow or another the father and this brother-in-law uncle are connected through some kind of esoteric thread. I know your uncle and your father, they kind of served together, didn't they?
No. My dad went into the Air Force in 1955, got out in 58 after the weird events of Shimmering Light. My uncle had no thought or intention to go in the military, certainly not a career in national security weirdness, but he was drafted in like 1950 or 51, and he was put into, he went into the 101st Airborne, and he was recruited to deliver some money behind the Iron Curtain. And so he parachuted in, the solo mission. And when he got back, they said, "Hey, good boy, good job. Now we need to introduce you to the gentleman who you just did this for." And he got in his service dress, and they picked him up from Fort Belvoir is where he was at. Now that's in Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
And they drove him out to the Virginia countryside, where he was introduced to the man who would become his career mentor, a gentleman by the name of James Jesus Angleton. Look him up, ladies and gentlemen. James Jesus Angleton was my mentor's mentor.
Yeah.
And I didn't find this out until 99. He always referred to him as the old man. Yeah. But in 99, when I was transitioning from the Air Force into going to work for some other guys in counterterrorism, he revealed that to me. And my jaw dropped. So my uncle, and when you look at all the weird things he taught me, like necromancy and pushing me towards remote viewing and other high strangeness, telling me there were people expecting me to know how to do this as an agent, This is all, folks, this is all through the late 80s and through the 90s. And, Nick Redfern didn't reveal to us the so-called Collins Elite until 2009. And so, whatever they really call themselves. So my uncle was involved in that kind of stuff, plus the various wars, as a special ops guy through Vietnam and all that. But he and my dad never directly served together.
That's similar to my case, because I don't believe my father or uncle served together literally. Right. I do think that they were involved with this Monuments Men project, which was huge. Even, the movie and even the novel, I don't think capture how big that thing was. There were all kinds of people involved with it at different levels. And I think that they were somehow involved with that, but I'm not saying that I think that they worked together. My uncle was in Italy at the time when my father was in Austria. So, they were countries apart, but somehow doing the same thing on an esoteric level. It had to do with these artifacts that the Nazis got,
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people have read on that and they know
now,
more about it than I do.
I do think that my uncle knew more about that weird episode in my dad's service time and in his life than my dad did at the time, and maybe even after, because it was my uncle that tipped me off to some certain things and told me to ask this person, that person, and then through my own, digging around. So I think that I'm certain that when my dad met my mom, my uncle probably already knew, the basics about who this guy was and what he was doing,
bet he did.
That he never revealed to my dad.
Because a guy like that would, in any case, be able to access that kind of information if he so wanted to.
Exactly. People have heard me talk about the mentor. Now, a little bit touch on what karmic frequency is from your perspective and your work, and how it might touch on all this we've been talking about today.
Yeah, karmic frequency is a very difficult subject to broach in an informal way, but I'll do the best I can. Essentially, what I'm arguing is that, first of all, space and time have a structure to them. And, and we could see it in the way the solar system is laid out, for example, and the way the planets move around the sun and all that. And of course, we have astrology, a whole corpus of knowledge that goes way back and probably goes back to Atlantis. They had a true science of it, and what we have today is a very garbled version of that. So karmic frequencies tend to connect to ideas in astrology. It's the idea that when you are born, it's not an accident. You have chosen to be born. You've chosen your parents, and there's a kind of script before you're born. You go through it in this other dimension of existence. There are probably other souls who help you do this, that you are connected with from earlier lives. And so you enter this world at a certain time and place. And out of that evolves a timeline in which certain key events in your life are going to happen according to a set of numbers. These numbers have meaning. I think it's the only person I've heard popularly talk about this idea of numbers is John Anthony West, and very well too, because he's coming at it from the ancient Egyptians. But it's the idea that a number is not just a quantity, it's a quality. So, the number 3 can symbolize a lot of different things. for example, the Trinity, traditionally, so each number has meaning to it. And as you live your life out, you live in these spans of time, and each span has a meaning to it. It's like it's saying, okay, you're born. Now, before you start school, you're going to live so many years, let's say 5 years, and that span of time is going to have a quality to it. Not just a quantity, but a quality. You're going to learn something in that span of time. You're going to feel something. You're going to be something. This is what karmic frequency is about. Karma, because it's an entanglement with physical reality. We're bringing that entanglement from other lifetimes. And then, so we'll go through these different phases of our lives: marriage, career, retirement, having children. All of these are nodes it's like frets on a stringed instrument, you might say. So, and now let's say you die, okay? This is the whole span, birth and death, and in between are these events. You can begin to understand your life better as you study what happens and when it happens and how that relates to other people you know. Like, let's say you want to understand your marriage. So you look at, well, how old was I when I got married? How old was my wife? When was my wife's parents born? And when was our first child born? These are all nodes. You begin to do an analysis. It can get quite complicated. But, early on, just as an experiment, you and I were talking about karmic frequencies, and I just got a few tidbits of information from you about, when your father was born, when your son was born. And I said, well, look, here's this pattern of 27. This number 27 means something to you. And, can really dig deep into that, trying to figure it out. But obviously, it's the number 9 embedded there.
Yeah.
Did anyone tell you to watch the 9s?
My mentor, my uncle, had told me in the late 80s that I personally need to pay attention to 9.
Mm-hmm.
Now I subsequently learned that 9, is a mystical number in some way.
Yeah.
But he told me, he said, that I should pay attention to 9 in particular. And you guys have heard this. Some of you, we have new folks coming to the channel each episode. I want to welcome all of them who have not heard me talk about this. They've not heard us talk about this. But essentially, my dad was born in 1936, a multiple of 9. He was 27, a multiple of 9. In 1963, a multiple of 9. When I was born, I was 27, a multiple of 9. In 1990, a multiple of 9. When my son was born, what's interesting is my son, it stopped with him. He doesn't have any kids yet. So for some curious reason, we have to assume it started with whoever my grandfather is. And that's a whole other thing I talk about here on the channel, is my real grandfather as opposed to the man I'm named after. And I don't know enough about him yet to know if he matches this pattern. I mean, this could be a string that goes way back, or it could be something that started consciously with this man, mm-hmm. impregnating my grandmother so that she would have the child in a 9-year. Yeah. And then whatever hocus pocus he was doing. Now, last week, Sesh, I explored the wild possibility with a little humor, that children's song, I'm My Own Grandpa. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this, in fact, I wrote my time travel novel as kind of an exploration of this, mm-hmm. that I actually, my last life was in the body of this John Aguirre guy, this Portuguese gentleman, Portuguese American, whatever, who fathered my dad, and I say his younger brother. And then I emerged in me, in other words, it skipped the generation so that I could be reborn in this body as Walter Bosley, whom you all know and love. And then the reason it ends with my son, I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but, I clearly unconsciously carried this out. I would say my dad unconsciously did it too. You know, it was like, oh, he met my mom in '58, and
Oh yeah.
you know, my sisters are
It's an unconscious purposiveness.
But here's more on the synchronicity, folks. Here's more, and Sesh appreciates this too. Sesh has provided me years ago with the amazing maps that I've talked about, you guys know about, and one of them shows that there are two major spiral energies in the continental U.S. One of them is in San Diego, starts at the Juan Cabrillo Monument and goes around and around and winds around San Francisco, San Diego Bay. Now, here's what's interesting. Before Sesh and I ever knew each other, you know, in my past life down in San Diego, my parents, their life is here in the San Bernardino Valley. My sisters are born at Loma Linda Hospital right up the street where my dad got his heart transplant and where he eventually died years after that. Because of a job that my dad had, he gets transferred temporarily down to San Diego, long enough for me to be conceived and born. And then like 2 months after I'm born, they pack up and decide to move back to Mothman country right before the Woody Dernberger stuff, a few years before the Woody Dernberger stuff's going to start, which I'm back there for. But think about it, folks. I'm the only one of my siblings born in the city where, you know, Juan Cabrillo is involved, and the hospital I'm born in is on the spiral that was on this map I would see.
Is that the first time you've revealed this, Walter, about your birth?
I don't think so, but I think it's been a long time since I talked about this. But not just the hospital I was born in, Sesh. We're talking where I lived and went to college when I was at San Diego State. We're talking about my life has been so connected to that spiral in San Diego, a spiral I didn't even know existed until a few years after we met and you started doing these maps for me. And folks, that's not an accident. Sesh will tell you the connections we have to the places we're born. And there is this concept Sesh introduced me to called it's the vector of desire and the axis of circumstance. Tell them about those.
Well, this gets pretty heavy, but you know, I discussed this in the Handprint of Atlas. If anybody will buy my book, they can read about it a little bit more.
Great book.
You can find I give an example of it in regard to Grover Cleveland, how his place of birth is encodes his involvement with the Statue of Liberty. The vector of the landmass going the way it's the compression stress in the land between his birth site over in New Jersey and the site of the Statue of Liberty, it's an actual vector pointing at it. So that when he was born, this was like a vector of desire. It's a synchronicity showing his entanglement with the Statue of Liberty. Of course, he was the president who inaugurated it, or, you know, when they had the unveiling ceremony, he gave the speech for it. So that's an example of it. The vector of desire, what you want, sometimes is actually encoded in where you're born, and there can be an actual line you can discover that points at something that's very important later on in your life. And in the case of you, Walter, with this spiral, it's more like the spiral of desire, I would call it. Because I've had a lifelong connection to San Diego. I love the city. It's a place where I can go and get centered. And look how much my parents didn't stay there, but I couldn't wait to get back. I go to college there, and then even after college, you know, I tried going back again. And then look what drew me down there: the whole Juan Cabrillo mystery, which first came to me directly through remote viewing stuff. So San Diego, is a mystical place for me. You're extremely entangled karmically with San Diego, Juan Cabrillo, and also the whole mystery of Coruscant, the Empire of the Wheel,
Is
because
connected.
all that is part of that spiral. You know, if you follow the spiral, it will go directly through the hospital where Walter was born. And then it will continue on around, and it will go through Disneyland. And then it will go on around to the exact point where Coruscant's body was found in Orbita Springs Park.
Yeah.
It's telling a story. You're part of that consecration. You know,
By the way,
like
by the way, I cannot say anything about it yet, but Malia and I unexpectedly, through another bit of business that we're doing and a different person, entirely complete different category, something has been revealed to us that we're going to get to go investigate firsthand. But it might be one of the most astonishing Juan Cabrillo connections to me and us, and you know, yet. Incredible. But I cannot say anything about it publicly.
Sure.
Because it's just unfolding, and it's a doozy. It blew our minds.
Oh,
and
that's fantastic.
We just discovered it in the last week, I'm gonna tease everybody. It has to do with a document that is well over 100 years old, and and that's based on documents that are centuries old. That's all I'm saying until we're saying more.
Oh, wow. You got my curiosity up. Wow. That's fantastic.
Well, hey, are you up for some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, folks, it's that time. We decided to go a little longer because, you know, the late hiccup start.
Yeah.
And, you know, Sesh has always got a lot of good stuff to tell us. So, folks, let's go for about 15 minutes with questions. And remember, if you're new here, you may not know it, but my mods and everybody in the live chat will tell you, if you're new here in the live chat, please put the questions in all caps, questions and comments in all caps. If you want them to be acknowledged, if you want them to be asked. A lot of side conversations go on in the live chat, and we need to know you're talking to us. And I ask that you please stay on topic. It's showing respect for the guest and the host if you stay on topic. So go ahead, live chat. Any questions on what we talked about today that you want to ask Sesh Heri? And it usually takes a moment. Oh, here we go already. We've got Oswald Spangler asks, how does Vatican II Council play into any of tonight's topics? Not directly, without going into a complete side.
That's a very complex matter, but
I understand why you're asking it, because we mentioned the Pope, but it really is way off.
I'd like to answer that question in this way.
Okay.
What's going on with the churches is extremely important in the development of history, and Vatican II was extremely important. I would be very interested in reading Joseph Farrell's take on the schism between the East and the West. He's an expert on that subject, and some way or somehow, someday, I'd like to get his book on that and read what he has to say, because I think it would be very much to the point. It would be something I'd be interested in.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's a gigantic tome and stuff.
Oh, really? I can imagine. Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah. It's
Thanks,
quite a subject.
Griffin Eagle, I'm going to come back to your question when we've exhausted the questions on the topic that we're talking about. Griffin Eagle has a question regarding our other episode where we were talking about the time travel stuff. But I will come back to it as soon as we've exhausted the questions on what we talked about tonight.
Right.
Because there are folks with questions about, or they're wondering about the things that we talked about.
I'm open to answering anything, it's your call, Walter.
Yeah, kind of like it kind of helps with, like, if people also, they're watching this recorded afterwards, and they're kind of following a flow of and they wonder. So, okay. Nick N. Sesh, do you recall the exact thing that made you consider the entities negative, or was it many things over time?
Excellent question, Nick N. Both. It was many things over time and some specific things, but for me, subjectively, it's a no-brainer, as they say. What these entities are, I want to put it this way: the more a non-human is involved with a human being, the more wrong is being done. This is a kind of tampering, metaphysically evil. The grays are evil. I know there, when I went to the 2007 International UFO Conference in Laughlin, and I put up on the big screen my illustration of the entity that kidnapped me when I was 6 years old, I got a lot of people laughing. Walter was there and he heard it. And a lot of those people are into the Space Brothers religion.
Yeah, the ETs are all friendly, and none of them could possibly be, bad.
And I'm not saying all non-humans are evil by any means, but this involvement with us subliminally and hypnotically and manipulating us, if you want to have any concept of right and wrong, it's all based upon free choice of the individual. Mm-hmm. We are either beings with rights, with human rights, or we're not. So it doesn't even make any sense to say, oh, they're good. What do you mean by good? What's your standard of morality? It's obvious that any being that's going to come in here against our will and do things to us, it's a kind of date rape. Hey, that's not too cool, is it, Walter? Date rape.
No, not at all.
It should be obvious that these beings are evil. They have their own agenda. People have asked me, well, what are they all about? What do they want? Were they trying to educate me? Nonsense. They are here to fulfill their own selfish agenda. And as I said, I've written a book about it. I can't get into it today, but in the future, we will cover this topic.
Yeah, and you're going to be coming back regularly. So let's go to Oswald Spengler's question. Is synchromysticism distinct from karmic frequency and synchronicity?
Well, I don't know what the term synchromysticism means.
We kind of get into it. That's kind of what we've been getting into over the years through karmic frequency and synchronicity.
Yeah, it's probably just nomenclature, but I am a student of Carl Jung, and I agree with a lot he has to say. But there's one aspect of it. He talks about it being an acausal phenomenon, and synchronicity is not acausal, but neither is it conventional causality as we understand it. Yeah. So it's a new form of causality, I believe, is in operation there, and we'd have to get into definitions of words, I think, to really hash that out.
Yeah.
But I think, a lot of these ideas, okay.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. I was trying to gauge that for as you finished that statement.
That's pretty much it.
So Martin Taylor asks, Sesh, is the spiral, I guess the one we're talking about, San Diego, is it a Fibonacci sequence? I can't remember what you told me.
Whenever I'm talking about spirals, that's the first thing anybody always asks me. Is it a Fibonacci spiral? In fact, I was in Kempton in 2006, and Christopher Dunn, I was talking to him about the spiral coming out of Florida, and he said, well, is that a Fibonacci spiral? It's very hard to talk about these things because people have read a little bit, and they've got a certain mindset, and they've heard about the Fibonacci spiral, and they think that's the only spiral or that's the most important spiral. It's a very interesting spiral, no doubt, and it is used quite a bit. but it's not the only spiral.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and no, the spiral coming out of the Cabrillo National Monument, passing through San Diego and up around through the Pacific Ocean and into Disneyland and the Inland Empire, that is not a Fibonacci spiral. I don't know what kind of spiral it is. I haven't analyzed it mathematically, and there may be a name for it. I doubt it. It's an unusual spiral, but Joseph Farrell might be able to tell us, right, Walter?
He might he might be able to. I call it a karmic synchronistic spiral, and we'll leave it at that for now.
There's an infinite number of sets of various kinds of spirals. This happens to be one kind of spiral. It's not important that it's a Fibonacci spiral.
Yeah. AO asks, do you think astrocartography, mapping lines and places, also links in with karma?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Very good question. I don't get too much into astronomy. I don't have much knowledge of astronomy. I know my limits, and I'm not pretending to know everything like some people do in alternative research. They've got an answer for everything,
Yeah.
I'm just an ordinary guy, trying to figure things out, basically. But I will say I do think I'm from a esoteric bloodline, and I do have certain paranormal qualities about myself that I have never pursued or tried to develop. The astrological or astronomical aspects of the ley lines are very important, and I understand that. But I'd say, if you're into operant magic and you want to do magical rituals and such, you need to know all about astronomy. I'm not into that, so I never bothered to study it, but it is very important. And sometimes we can see that certain events are happening at a certain time because of the way the planets are aligned.
Exactly.
That's about all I can say on it.
Shane Walker asks, do you think things like illness and trauma can alter a person's karmic frequency, or are those things a result of it?
I'd say they're a result of it. And particularly, when, let's say I'll give a good example. Christopher Reeve and his tragic accident where he broke his neck. My personal opinion, that was part of his karma. And you probably, if you wanted to take the trouble of analyzing it, when he was born, when he died, when that event occurred, when he did his first big movie role, Superman, I guess it was, you could probably plot that out. When he was married, when his children were born, you could do a whole karmic frequency analysis, and that accident would pop up as a pattern. You would see a pattern there. Okay, that's the one thing about the karmic frequencies. They are like, I liken them to a crystal. When you look at a crystal, it can be beautiful. It's a pattern there. That is exactly the way the karmic frequencies are. So, in my opinion, illnesses and various trauma, it's part of your life story. And if you can find the wisdom to recognize that, it will help you in your trauma. It will help you in coping with the deaths of loved ones. I've had a lot of deaths in my family in the last few years, and particularly my brother, Tom. He was very close to me, and his death was a huge shock and blow. It happened in 2022. But I had already done somewhat of karmic frequency analysis with him, but I plunged into his lifeline, and I saw that was his time. That was his karmic frequency to go then. He had fulfilled his life. And it helped me a great deal. So There are some people who have said to me, and Walter knows this, I won't say who it was, but he actually, he looked at my early karmic frequency analysis, and he said, stop, you don't know what you're doing, quote unquote. Well, of course, I didn't know what I was doing. Who does when they're experimenting and learning and whatever? I still
Right.
don't know what I'm doing, you know. But I say that you have to use common sense with these things. You could use the karmic frequency analysis as a kind of divination, and you could go way off base with it. I'm not advocating that at all, but I think if you use common sense, you can use it in a positive way. That's my point.
Absolutely. Okay, this is going to be the last question. Nick N is curious, Sesh, if you think the spiral areas, are also acting like transmitting antenna or something along those lines. I think that's a really intriguing idea. Something to it.
It's a very intriguing idea, and Nick is spot on with that. Absolutely, they are that very thing. And I've written a novel about that, and it's going to be coming out, in the next year or so. It's called The Swan Song of Breed's Hill. And it's the whole story of the Battle of Bunker Hill and how they used ley lines to win the War of Independence. And it's a true story. It's about one of my direct ancestors. And absolutely, this is one of the ways ley lines have been used. And this is what they were doing with the Coruscanton mystery. This is what they were doing with Disneyland. All of this involves physical energies, but also astral energies. And I'll talk about that more in the future. But yes, they are like an antennae. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, hey, I think we've used up all your time, and I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank the guys at the Video Lab for helping you be here.
You're great.
And
I just hope everybody at the beginning got to what I was reading. I don't know. We got a kind of a rough start there, but I guess everybody made sense of it.
Well, I got to tell you, we've had a great turnout for you, and I want to do this regularly. So, folks, you're going to be hearing a lot more from Sesh Heri. And in the meantime, please go to walterbosley.com for the hardcover Wonder of the Worlds, his fantastic novel about Nikola Tesla, Mark Twain, and a young Harry Houdini journeying to Mars on an adventure in 1893 aboard a Tesla airship. But also, folks, you must get your hands on the Handprint of Atlas. You can get that at lulu.com, LULU.com. And just get your hands on that book, because that's very much a must read. And there's going to be more books coming from Sesh, a whole bunch more. Wonder of the Worlds is a trilogy. The other two books, we're hoping to get those out this calendar year as hardcovers. And he's illustrated the other two books. So This is what's different. Someone asked, Nick asked, what was different about the paperback and the hardcover Wonder of the Worlds? Well, it's hardcover. But the difference between the paperback and hardcover Metamorphosis and the Lost Pleiad is that the hardcovers will be illustrated. They have illustrations for them.
Right.
So
as they were originally meant to be, the original concept was that they were all going to be illustrated, and now they are.
Yes, they are. They are.
Touch, but I think it's fun.
And there's more books that are coming beyond that, folks, in the coming next year or two. So, Sesh, thank you again.
Thank you.
And we're going to, I'll talk with you about how soon you're going to come on again.
Okay.
All righty.
Talk to you later.
Have a good night. Okay, folks. Another fantastic show. I mean, anytime we have Sesh Heri on, the discussion is just, it's always more revealing. And I thank you all for being in the live chat, and all of the others who are watching. If you're new to the Walter Bosley channel, thank you for coming. Please check out the NIMSACon. Get your tickets for NIMSACon. They're officially available today. Go to walterbosley.com/shop, and you can get your tickets for NIMSACon. Remember, folks, Sesh Heri is going to be there speaking at the conference, but he's going to be there the whole weekend. You get to hang out with him, talk to him personally. And that's going to be the weekend of October 11th through 13th. To experience NIMSACon, you must attend NIMSACon. This will not be a streamed event, folks, nor will it be recorded in its entirety and played later. The only way you're going to get to really experience NIMSACon is if you attend. We'll post some highlights after the show, but that's only going to be about 20 minutes of highlights through a whole 3-day weekend. You're not going to be able to get NIMSACon in its entirety on video. So join us in Sonora, California in October 11th through the 13th, but go get your tickets now for this 3 days of NIMSACon. It's only $174. That is an outstanding conference price there. So walterbosley.com/shop, get your NIMSA tickets, check out the books and stuff. And remember, buy the books from walterbosley.com. Don't get them at Amazon. Amazon takes all of our royalty. So, go to walterbosley.com. And again, I want to thank all of you. If you're new here, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you come back. We're going to be back on Wednesday with a new episode of California with Todd Wood. So I know you guys, and that one is, Malia, help me out. I'm already forgetting what the title is. Oh, this Wednesday, it's Macario Timmons and the Satanic Panic of the 1920s. So it's a doozy. It'll be good. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll see you on Wednesday.